Hello, and welcome to the Illinois LawCast, a podcast about the wisdom, wit, and curiosity of the University of Illinois College of Law. I'm your host, Chris Davies, and in this episode I will be speaking with Kam Cox, the Assistant Athletic Director for Strategic Initiatives here at Illinois, as well as an adjunct professor for the College of Law. When he was hired for his role with the athletics department, Kam was the first name, image, and likeness, or NIL, specialist at a Power 5 school. In our interview, we discuss how he came to this position, how the changing legal landscape of college athletics has changed his job, and the ways he helps Fighting Illini athletic teams find success. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Kam Cox, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Let's go back to where you started with the law and your path towards a career in law.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I think that the story fairly starts where I was born. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, and grew up there. Folks still live there. Went to high school there, and then from there I went to Auburn. And when I went to Auburn, I didn't know anyone down there. I didn't know anyone who'd ever gone there. I just had a really good visit one just spring afternoon and decided, let's give it a whirl. And when I went down there, my freshman year was the year that Auburn won the championship in football. And I kind of saw the power of college athletics specifically to kind of incorporate a kid from far away into the kind of greater campus environment. And obviously I made some of my best friends and everything down there too. From there, I went to law school at Vanderbilt. And I remember the summer before I started law school at Vanderbilt, just trying to kind of find things to talk about with my fellow Zero L's. Vanderbilt won the College World Series. And so, again, it was kind of this moment where college athletics had created a little bit more of a community. When I graduated from Vanderbilt, I did not go immediately into kind of the sports world. I worked as a securities lawyer for a couple of large firms up in New York City. But I knew that if I had an opportunity to break into college sports, that I was probably going to take it. And so toward the back half of my time practicing, I really started to get a bit more aggressive about figuring out, well, what does that actually look like? Like, what are the roles? What are the functions? And then who are some of the key folks who can maybe facilitate an introduction for me and maybe even an opportunity? And eventually, I found that opportunity. I had a chance to break into college athletics in June of 2021, just before name, image, and likeness went into effect. And in some ways, the rest is history. So it's interesting because I would say at the time, it wasn't clear to me that the story was going to unfold in the linear way that I just kind of told it. And it didn't feel like that. But I think in retrospect, there was actually a path where we were always kind of marching forward. And I'm really excited to be doing something that I love.
Was sports always something that you were interested in, something that was a part of your life? Or obviously a couple national championships while you're a student doesn't hurt anything?
Yeah. No, very much so. I think growing up in the shadow of, the big blue shadow of Kentucky basketball, specifically men's basketball, but also women's basketball. And then some of the stuff that I got a chance to see when I was at Auburn, it really made me uniquely interested in the business of sports and what was going on. So I do think it's something I was always kind of intrigued by. I don't know that I actually planned to pursue it because I didn't know or have the exposure to the way that it worked. And so a lot of the work that I want to do at the law school is make sure that our young people are exposed to careers in sports and that they can think about the types of things they might be able to do in sports or the ways that their skill sets might be valuable to sports leagues, sports clubs, or kind of other places in the sports ecosystem. Interesting.
And when you're studying law at Vanderbilt, are you thinking about sports at all? Are you thinking how, I know here we have the Sports Law Society. Is that something that you were interested in then, or was it just peripheral?
A little bit. When I was at Vanderbilt my 3L year, I had a chance to actually intern for the athletic department. My sports law professor was the late, great David Williams, kind of this titan of sports administration, and Vanderbilt's athletic director at the time. And so I kind of had a little bit of an introduction to it. But I'll tell you the way that one of my mentors told me several years ago that there's really no such thing as sports law. There's only the law, and then it applies in these interesting ways to sports. And so I guess to answer your question, I wasn't intentionally studying sports law, but I did have this interest in sports. I had this interest in what I thought was a distinct body of sports law. And like every other student, I was spending way too much time with my head in a book trying to learn the law, right? And so I think I was building my skills to do it, even though I wasn't necessarily directly trying to do that at the time.
And then you graduate, working private, and you come back to athletics. What was that first job that you got in the college athletics world?
Well, I'll tell the story in the way that it ought to be told. When I showed up here in Champaign, I'd never been to Champaign before, ever. And it was funny because I showed up at night. For those of you who are familiar with Champaign, you can appreciate, like, I'm kind of coming down NIL, and then eventually I get on to Kirby, but I can't really see anything. And then the stadium just like appears out of nowhere, right? But that shows you I didn't know anything. And so I showed up, and my job was to kind of be the NIL czar, which was not the title, right? There is no title that's czar of really anything. But the thought was that student athlete name, image, and likeness was potentially this big seismic shift that was going to come to college athletics. But we didn't know if that actually was going to unfold. And even if it did, we had very little sense of how it was going to unfold or how it would be important to student athletes, how we would serve student athlete needs as it unfolded. And so it was my job to kind of watch and be on top of that. And in doing so, I realized I had to pull at several strings, some of which were legal, some of which were business, some of which were just totally unlike anything I'd ever seen before. But I think that what you really figure out in law school and then also when you practice law is sometimes you just have to figure stuff out even where you really don't know what's going on. And I always tell my students as lawyers, we're kind of tasked with being the people who actually read the stuff. But the cool thing about actually reading the stuff is you'll be impressed with how much you can figure out. And so in time, we started to get a better understanding of kind of not only what was going to be important to student athletes in the NIL space, but also the ways that the NIL space may be able to foreshadow additional changes that come to college athletics. And so since I came here, my role has shifted really several times, but it's always focused on the disruptions in the industry, of which there are several.
Yeah. And when you started here, you were the first kind of NIL specialist in the Power Five. Is that correct?
I was. At that time, I was like the first person who had been hired to only do NIL stuff, because, again, it wasn't clear at that moment that NIL was going to be something that required an individual to spend all of her time on. Now there are a bunch of us because it's very, very clear that an individual does need to spend all of her time on that. But then there are other things, too, that have kind of developed since I first started here. And so it's been really, really interesting to watch that. But I think it's given me a unique perspective because I was there at the beginning. And so I remember when, well, we had our kind of first state law around NIL, then we had our second one, then we had our third one. And then I see the other state laws that are developing around the country, too. And I think about the way that NCAA policy has developed and shifted and the way that the conferences have changed since then and everything else, to say nothing of just the additional slate of student athlete benefits and everything that kind of is on the horizon. So I think that role gave me a unique perspective, not just into name, image, and likeness, but into the way that college athletics worked in the past and the way that it maybe is going to work in the future. So it was really interesting.
So when you start here, the job's obviously different than it is now. What was it like at that point? What was your, if not day-to-day, your regular things that you were doing as NIL czar?
Don't give me that title. It's not, and I don't know that I earned that. I was really just trying to earn people's trust. I think I always tell our students, like, that's kind of the most important thing. When you first show up, you want to be around and you want people to know that you're here to solve problems. And you want people to know that you're nice. Those are really the three things. Like, just be there, try hard, and make sure everybody knows that you're nice and that you've got a good attitude. I think what I found was that my group of everybody was very large because I served so many different stakeholders. Our kind of core stakeholders, our student athlete. So we served them. But I also served our coaches who run our programs. I served the other administrators. I served the campus. But then I realized the visibility of what we do in the athletic department also made it where I kind of served like the fans and the media too. And so I think for me, my day to day was all about kind of getting out there and evangelizing about how important the changes to name, image, likeness were going to be, with the thought that they probably were actually going to be that important, but I didn't really know. Because if you remember back then, it still happens in college athletics just because of its visibility. There was this undercurrent of chatter about, well, student athletes now are going to be able to make third-party money for third-party services. But people had no idea actually how it worked. And the funny secret is really neither did I, but I knew more than other people at that time just because I'd read the stuff, right? Yeah. And so I would go out and I would do all these different lunch meetings, and I would do a bunch of different presentations, and I would take all these meetings with student athletes, in part to explain that there was this big change coming, but also to educate myself. Any meeting that someone wanted, if they reached out to me, I would take it back then because I just wanted to hear more and more perspectives, and I wanted to make sure that I had a pretty good handle on what this amoeba may turn into.
And I think even casual observers of college athletics know that NIL has revolutionized. But what have you seen in your time as the biggest changes? Even just starting in 2021 to today, what's really been the biggest effect of these multiple cases, multiple changes?
Wow, that's a big one. But let me take two answers. I think that one of the biggest changes has been the NCAA's diminishing capacity to govern college athletics, and that's been a legal change. Effectively, the involvement of several state laws to kind of conflict with and ultimately override NCAA policy has been really a big weapon that has diminished the NCAA's ability to pass and enforce its rules. And then at the same time, there have been a handful of challenges under Section 1 of the Sherman Act. I mean, there's one just the other day that have also diminished the NCAA's capacity to kind of pass and enforce its rules. And so I think that's the big thing, is that the question of who's in charge, you kind of learn that in Civ Pro when you talk about personal subject matter jurisdiction. The question of who's in charge is really a core question in terms of thinking about, well, how are things going to develop? And the answer isn't entirely clear anymore, but before it was clearly the NCAA, right? Now I think there are other stakeholder groups where you say, well, maybe it's this group, maybe it's that group, but maybe it's still the NCAA, but it's not entirely clear that that's the case. I think that's probably the biggest legal change. I would say the other change, it's kind of most people who've observed it or followed it would probably attest to, is that there's been a tremendous uptick in player movement. Like student athlete transfers have really increased over the past few years because the kind of changes to the transfer portal requirements, so the kind of abdication of the year in residence requirement as a result of kind of a Section 1 challenge, have combined with the intensity of the NIL arms race to really increase player movement. And so I think those have probably been the biggest things. I think that if you would have told me back then that we would get where we were now, I would have said, well, gee, yeah, maybe in 10 years, not in 3 years. But that just speaks to the importance of legal changes and the speed at which legal changes can create really material outcomes.
So with these changes in mind, what is your role in the athletics department, and what are you doing today with athletes, coaches, fans, all these stakeholders that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so today I serve as one of our assistant athletic directors for strategic initiatives. And I do a bunch of stuff. I think that probably when I describe it, the best way for me to kind of articulate it is that my job really falls into three buckets. I think about our offensive bucket, our defensive bucket, and then what I'll call kind of the campus bucket. So the offensive bucket is all about what can make us better. So what can make us better competitively, and then what can make us better operationally. So whether it's, okay, how do we evaluate our spending and our investments, or whether it's about how we evaluate talent, those are two things that I work on kind of on the offensive side. I think on the defensive side, it's all about, okay, how do we avoid liability? And then how do we make sure that our student athletes are having a good experience, right? We don't want student athletes to have a bad experience because, one, we're here to serve young people, but two, because they can leave relatively easily. And so a lot of that stuff has to do with the potential legal challenges. And so we always want to think about, all right, well, if we do this, well, what effect may that have on our Title IX risk? Or if we do that, or if we want to ask folks about, a particular strategy, well, do we open ourselves up to antitrust, and like what's the right forum to kind of ask the right questions? So I think of those as being defensive things. And then in terms of my campus bucket, there's a lot of things that I do around the kind of economic impact that we make on just the university in Champaign County. And then also the ways that what we're doing is in strategic alignment with the campus more broadly. The university has challenges that it's trying to kind of defeat, if you will, I guess to use sports terminology. And it's our job to help the university do so. And I think because of the uniqueness of what we do in the athletic department, it gives us a real chance to kind of do that. So when we think about the strength of athletics marketing as it works in combination with university marketing, it's really, really important that we're marketing ourselves in a way that the university finds productive. And so we make sure that we do that too. So I think those are probably the three things, but different stuff comes up all the time. And, regardless of what it is, I think I'm still somebody who will raise their hand and say, hey, let me tackle that and try to read the stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a lot of things on your plate already, but you're also an adjunct professor here at the College of Law.
Sure.
You did a class this last semester. Can you go through a little bit of what you're teaching our students here?
Yeah. So this was my third year of having a chance to come over here and serve. And I've really enjoyed it. I'll say the first 2 years, just characteristically, were about the class focused on the evolution of the name, image, and likeness rules, like kind of how they came to be and what makes them kind of difficult to administer and follow, another thing. But this past time I taught, we really changed it and I broadened it. And it's really more about the history and the trajectory of student athlete compensation more broadly. So some of you may know that historically, student athletes were prohibited from receiving kind of any type of compensation in exchange for kind of their athletic participation, including scholarships, and there were restrictions on coach recruitment, and there were all types of restrictions. And over the course of the 20th century, those restrictions were really eroded because the increased commercial opportunity around college athletics, and specifically major college athletics, kind of placed those restrictions in tension, particularly in the eyes of the public, right? Because people felt like, well, gee, if there's not a lot of money being made and this thing looks a lot like the rest of university programming, well, then sure, okay, student athletes aren't eligible for scholarships or stipends or whatever, and that's fine. But as that became increasingly less true, it started to feel like, well, maybe student athletes should be eligible to receive some of those benefits. And obviously, in kind of deciding which student athletes are going to get which benefits and why, it creates all these other sorts of governance issues. And so really the class starts at 1906, kind of the foundation of the precursor to the NCAA, and we talk about what may happen as far as 10 years in the future, to the extent that anybody can actually know.
Yeah.
But I think the students have enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed teaching it. It was a bit of a challenge just to pack all that stuff in. But I think it was cohesive enough, and maybe even a prediction or two will turn out to be right.
Yeah. Do you have any good predictions that you've that you want to share here? Or?
Well, the problem with making predictions is you might be wrong, but the other thing is you might be right. So I'll make two. I think that college athletics is continuing to shift in a way such that you will probably see a greater consolidation of those who have more leverage in the landscape and ecosystem, and whether that is in kind of institutional consolidations within conferences, whether that's across conferences, whether that's greater conference movement, like I don't necessarily know, whether that's something inside the NCAA, like I don't know, but I think that there's going to be a kind of a greater consolidation of power, for one. And I think that you may start to see, and we have to be very careful about this, but a fundamental change in the relationship between student athletes and their institutions. I think that there are a handful of legal challenges still out there that in my view, are seeking to change that. And the problem with changing things is that, well, they're different. So you might accomplish one thing or kind of fix one challenge, but then open up a whole different can of worms. And I'm afraid that that's likely to happen with some of the constructs that are being put out there now. But I do think that when we look back here 10 years from this conversation, we'll say, well, gee, for one, it seems like the powerful have kind of come together in a room. I don't know who that's going to be or what room that's going to be in, but I think that may happen. And for two, we may say that the student athlete model that we kind of grew up with is even more distinct from what we understood.
It's interesting. And I see you thinking through these things, and I'm wondering, obviously your job helps inform what you're teaching. Does thinking through things in the classroom help inform what you're doing at the athletic department?
Absolutely. I think that the teaching is actually probably my biggest, it was a secret weapon, but now I have to come out and admit it. It was probably my biggest weapon, just because teaching really forces you to put things into like a coherent theoretical framework, to say, I'm looking at this entire landscape of activities. I'm looking at all these changes. I'm looking at all these different underlying rules. I'm starting to understand all these bodies of law, and I'm seeing how these things have shifted. And then it requires you to kind of show up at work and think about, okay, what is actually the problem, or what is happening? And it becomes much more clear to you when you've got to basically go out there and get deposed by 60 smart young people for a few nights. I think you make sure that you're on top of your game, but in doing so, it makes you more productive. And I think it helps us help the university a little bit better.
Yeah. And as we're talking, the football team is getting ready for a big bowl game.
That's right.
Our men's and women's basketball teams are seeing great success.
That's right.
And I know some of the other sports are also
several other Big Ten championships this year. Volleyball was in the NCAA tournament. We are very proud at the athletic department.
Yeah, and your role, it's for people who, a lot of people might be Illini fans listening and,
Sure.
and aware of that success. Where does your role, how do you help elevate those students and the athletics to success? And how have you, over the last 4 years, where we've seen particularly those big revenue sports get so much better, how do you see your role in that?
I see my role as, I wouldn't say that I'm as integral as the head coach, right, to something like that. But I think that it's interesting, how do I say it? Like, behind what happens on the field, there's a competition that happens off the field. I'll say a few years ago, I was at a talk and Coach Bielema was there, and he said something that really struck me, and he was right. It was before our first game that year was against Nebraska, and he said, look, we can't, I don't know if it was 50 days away or whatever, but he said, we can't just show up 50 days from now and try to beat Nebraska. Like, we've got to beat Nebraska every day until then. And I think of my role as being kind of a big part of making sure that we beat Nebraska or Indiana or Purdue or Michigan or whoever every day until then, because a lot of what we're trying to do is figure out what levers to pull to make sure that we can give our coaches and our student athletes the best chance to be successful, under the assumption that if they're successful, then we, the collective we who kind of focus on the block I, are all going to be more successful. One of the big ways that we have to do that in this moment of disruption is by understanding the disruptions, right? Because when we think about, well, we played Michigan in football this year and we won, but we didn't win because we were just bigger and had more money, because we were not bigger and we don't have more money, right? But we still won by 2 touchdowns. And so it's this question about, all right, what are the right types of investments that we need to make on the operational side to give ourselves a chance to win, understanding that the other team has got more money, right? And we were able to do that. So whether it's, okay, how do we make personnel investments to make sure that there's a better in-game experience? How to make sure that there basically are more fans who are there to cheer on the team? Or is it, well, what do we need to do on the equipment side to make sure that our folks have what they need when they're out there competing? What do we do on the nutrition side? Like, all of those things, it's a question of resource deployment and really targeted resource deployment. And so I think of my job on the day-to-day as being a lot of evaluation of the resource deployment and then prediction of how we ought to deploy resources. And then obviously prediction about how we might be able to deploy even greater amounts of resources in the future or in different places. Because sometimes you may say, okay, well, let's hold this back now, understanding we're going to have another opportunity in a little bit when the landscape shifts. So I think of myself as helping in that. And there was obviously a ton of people in the athletic department who I think of as being really key to helping in that. But we're kind of the team off the field.
Excellent. Kam, thank you very much for coming in and talking to me today. And thanks for all you bring to the university.
I appreciate it. Go Illini.
Thank you again to Kam Cox for pulling himself away from the exciting world of Illini athletics to talk to me. A big thank you to all of our listeners as well for listening to the podcast. If there is a person or topic you would like to hear more about on the Illinois LawCast, please send an email to podcast@law.illinois.edu. You can subscribe to the Illinois LawCast wherever fine podcasts are available, and find a video version of our episodes on YouTube. This episode was recorded, mixed, and edited by me, Chris Davies. Special thanks to Kelly Moss for our album art, and Krista Gatke for her help in the editing process. Until next time, thanks again for listening to the Illinois LawCast.